Aloha, and welcome to this presentation of the Vegan Society of Hawaii. We are delighted today to welcome Joyce Tischler, JD. Joyce Tischler is Professor of Practice in Animal Law at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, Portland, Oregon. She teaches Industrial Animal Agriculture Law and Animals in the Law survey course. She co-authored Animal Law, New Perspectives on Teaching Traditional Law, and is now co-authoring the first casebook on industrial animal agriculture law in the United States. Joyce has devoted her career to advancing the field of animal law. In 1979, she co-founded the first U.S. nonprofit dedicated to protecting animals using the legal system, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, ALDF. She served as the ALDF's executive director for 25 years, and then as its general counsel until the spring of 2019. Her talk today is called This Stinks: Industrial Animal Agriculture Victimizes Animals and the Planet. I'd like now to give a warm welcome and a warm aloha to Joyce Tischler. Hi.
Aloha. Each year, 10 billion animals are raised and slaughtered in the US to be eaten, 80 billion worldwide. Those numbers are staggering. Most farmed animals in the US are raised in massive barn-style industrial facilities that are called concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFO. And that's the term you'll hear me use throughout this talk. It's another look at a different CAFO. I prefer to call these places CAFO, even though some people call them factory farms, because to me that's misleading. These have nothing to do with farming. These mega facilities are completely different from the farms that existed for most of US history. This is an industrialized factory system for raising animals. It's controlled by very few large corporations. You know the names: Tyson, Purdue, Smithfield, Cargo. You see these buildings over there? That's where the animals live their entire lives. They are crowded together in intensive confinement. They can't walk around freely or feel grass beneath their feet. There's no grass. There's no fresh air to breathe. There's nothing that is natural to their species. If they become sick or injured, they're not going to receive veterinary medical care. They're going to be left to suffer and perhaps to die. If you want to get a feeling for the conditions that they live in, imagine being strapped into a seat, not in business class, in lower class, on an airplane, and you're sitting in your own waste, and you're breathing putrid air, and you have nothing to do, and that's how it is for your entire life. CAFOs are designed to minimize the amount of human labor involved in raising animals for food. They maximize profits for the corporations that operate them, and they provide allegedly, and I say allegedly, cheap food for the American people. The animals who are forced to live in this food production system suffer because of intensive confinement, which means overcrowding. They can't act as they normally would. They can't move freely. They can't get away from more aggressive animals. They suffer from mutilations, debeaking, dehorning, castration, tail docking, toe clipping, which is removing first digit of the toe for turkeys. All of this is done without anesthesia and without pain relief. There are breeding procedures and practices by the industry that are intended to maximize the output from the animals, such as massive breasts. Turkeys have been bred to grow massive breasts. Chickens who grow too fast. Dairy cows who now have giant-sized udders. There's a lack of individual treatment or care, lack of veterinary care for diseases, for broken bones, for illnesses. There's no care. And practices such as forced molting, where hens are starved for 2 weeks to force them to produce more eggs. I will get into this in more detail in just a minute. In addition to forcing billions of animals to live in a state of constant overcrowding and suffering, CAFOs also damage our environment, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and soil. They contribute to climate change. They endanger human health through the overuse of antibiotics. They destroy local farming communities, and they abuse farm workers. CAFOs are not some result of age-old wisdom. They started in the 1950s. It's an experiment, and I'm going to explain to you why this experiment has failed and how it's causing great harm, not only in the US, but in other countries where it's been introduced. Some of you folks may know about the living conditions for the animals, but for those who don't, I want to give you a primer. The first animals we come across are broilers. I don't know if any of you ever have hung out with chickens. I have. I've lived with chickens. They are highly social beings. They like to forage in the grass. They love to look for bugs. They like to dust bathe, and they get into these, they create a little hole and they wiggle their behinds and they get the dust going all over them, and that cleans out their feathers. They like a variety of fruits and vegetables. They also like pasta. I tried that. They get bored if they can't forage for bugs and food. They prefer to sleep on a roost, similar to a dowel, a narrow tree limb, and they can curl their toes around that, and that's how they like to sleep. As you can see, there's none of that for these CAFO chickens. They've been there since they were little tiny chicks. They were born and then brought to this facility. The meat industry calls them broilers. My friend Kim Sterla calls them peepers because by the time they're sent to slaughter, they're so young that they still are peeping. There may be 20,000, 30,000 broilers in a building. They are, as you can see, crowded together. They can't exhibit natural behavior. They're living in their own urine and feces. These birds have been selectively grown so that they reach market weight in 7 weeks of age. In the past 50 years, the rate at which they grow has increased by 300%. Now, what that means for the chickens, their skeletons have trouble supporting this incredibly fast growth. So they experience skeletal issues, deformities, their legs break. And if their legs break, then they can't walk and they can't get to food. This rapid growth sometimes also causes acute heart failure because their hearts and their lungs can't effectively circulate oxygen throughout their bodies, oxygen and blood. These are hens. You've seen these before, I'm sure. 95% of egg-laying hens still in the US spend their lives in these cages. They're called battery cages. They are wire all around, stacked row upon row with 5 to 10 birds per cage. They lose their feathers and their bodies are covered with sores and bruises because they don't have any way to get away from more aggressive birds because they're banging into the sides of these cages. Just a century ago, hens produced 100 eggs per year. These CAFO hens have been selectively bred to produce somewhere around 250 to 300 eggs per year. That kind of production is abnormal, and it's very hard on their bodies. Natural lifespan for chickens is somewhere between 5 to 8 years, but after 1 to 2 years, these hens start to produce fewer eggs, so they're sent to slaughter to become frozen dinners or pot pies or fertilizer. Male chicks cannot lay eggs, so they're killed as soon as they hatch. The killing methods are inhumane. They're sucked through pipes onto an electrified kill plate. They are gassed. They're thrown into boxes like this where they're just left to die, or they are sent down a conveyor belt, which drops them into a macerator where they are ground up alive and fully conscious. Some countries are starting to ban the killing of male chicks, forcing the industry to turn to technological fixes, such as sexing the chicks while they're still in the egg and killing them before they're born. But that's just beginning to catch on. Sows, you've probably heard about sows. Sows are female pigs. And as everybody knows, I think, pigs are highly intelligent. They've been rated as intelligent as dogs. And I'm going to offer some generalizations about them, but I want to note that each of the species I'm talking about, the animals are individuals, just as we are. Their social lives are as complex, pigs that is, their social lives are as complex as those of primates. They enjoy foraging, exploring, they like to play with other pigs. They tend to be quite curious. They have passed the mirror test, which means they have self awareness. They tend to have excellent memories, and they prefer to be clean. Approximately 6 million female pigs, sows, spend their entire lives like this in intensive confinement. They live in enclosures that are called crates. Crates are approximately 7 feet long by 2 feet wide, which is only slightly wider than the sow. Sows are impregnated when they are housed in these gestation crates. 1 week before piglets are born, the sows are transferred from these gestation crates to farrowing crates. Now, the farrowing crate has the same amount of room for the sow, but there's a separate compartment where the piglets are. And then the concern is that the sow might lie on her piglets, so the piglets are kept separate, and they can get through to eat, to nurse from the pig. Whether the pig is in a gestation crate or a farrowing crate, it is physically impossible for her to walk. It's physically impossible for her to turn around. So these sows are psychologically distressed because they don't have anything to do with their time. They're bored, they're frustrated, they can't forage, they can't explore, they can't spend time with other sows in a normal, natural way. That's part of their normal social structure. They are seen biting at the bars or biting at the air just to deal with boredom. The air in these facilities is so putrid, and they're living in their own filth because their urine and feces goes through slats, but some of it doesn't. They're also in physical pain because the lack of exercise and the lack of nesting materials, which they would normally use, is very hard on their bodies, on their joints. According to scientific studies, sows in gestation and farrowing crates experience physical suffering. They become lame due to weaker bones and muscles caused by lack of exercise. They need exercise just as we do. There are abrasion injuries because they don't have hay or other nesting materials. They're always on hard flooring. They get cardiovascular problems, digestive problems, and an elevated risk of urinary tract infections. Their lives are an endless cycle of pregnancy, nursing, and then pregnancy, nursing, and then it's the same, okay? They are treated as if they were nothing more than machines. Pigs can live to be 10 to 15 years old, but after about 2.5 years, these sows are sent to slaughter. These are their babies. These are the piglets who are raised to be eaten. Approximately 60 million pigs are raised in the US each year. Soon after they are born, their teeth are clipped, their tails are cut off, and the males are castrated. All of this is done without anesthesia or painkillers. When they're about 3 weeks old, they're taken from their mothers, which is far younger than they would naturally wean from their mothers. They live in crowded cages inside a massive building, similar to what I showed you at the start. They have nothing to occupy their time, no soft bedding to lie on. The air is putrid. It sometimes causes the pigs to get sick, and it can be deadly if the fans in the building stop operating and pull the putrid air to the outside. 60 to 80% of these pigs are dosed with a substance called ractopamine. It's a drug that makes their meat leaner, but it has a lot of negative side effects for the pigs. Tremors, chronically elevated heart rates, broken limbs, higher risk of hoof lesions, and in some cases, death. More than 160 countries have banned the use of ractopamine, including China, Russia, Taiwan, and all of the members of the European Union. But it continues to be used in the US. Once these piglets are 6 months old and they reach 250 pounds, they are sent to slaughter. If you haven't picked up on it yet, when we eat pigs, when we eat chickens, when we eat beef, we're eating baby or teenage animals. They're all young when they go to slaughter. If you've ever hung out with cows, you know that they're friendly. They love to have their necks scratched. They can be very pleasant to be around. When they're young, they like to romp and run and play with each other. Calves who are raised to be eaten are probably accorded better treatment than most of the other animals in the CAFO system because they're allowed to live with their mothers and they're raised on pasture land for about the first 6 months. But then they are sent to someplace like this, a giant feedlot where they are fed on grain. A feedlot may hold as many as 100,000 cattle. And again, they're living in their own feces and urine. The air, even though they're outside, the air is nasty. There's a place called Harris Ranch in Southern California. And if you've ever traveled down to Los Angeles on Route 5, you can smell Harris Ranch many miles before you actually see it. They're eating grains, and grains are not natural for their bodies. Their bodies don't react well to the grains, so they develop problems with that. They're sent to slaughter when they're teenagers. They're about 18 months, sometimes a little later. Dairy cows. Well, like sows, they are treated as if they were machines. In order to produce milk, cows, like all other mammals, have to go through pregnancy. So dairy cows spend their lives being impregnated, going through the pregnancy, giving birth, and then being put immediately back on the production line to produce milk. Their calves are taken away from them anywhere from 1 hour to 3 days after the calves are born, which is extremely distressing to both the cow and the calf. These cows have been selectively bred to produce twice as much milk as they did only 40 years ago, a massive increase. And it takes its tolls on their bodies. They often develop lameness. Mastitis is a prevalent and painful problem. A cow could live to be 15 to 20 years old. After 3 to 4 years of producing huge volumes of milk and giving up or having stolen several babies, these cows are then sent to slaughter and made into hamburger. If you've heard the word downed cow, that refers to dairy cows usually because their bodies have been so overly stressed that they are either too sick or too crippled to even walk into the slaughterhouse by themselves. And that's where their babies go. These calves, if you've ever hung out with calves, they're a lot like puppies. They're full of energy. They're playful. They like to jump around. They like to kick their feet. They like to buck. They like to play with each other. If offered a ball, they will play with the ball. Male calves, like male chicks, are not needed by the dairy industry. So they are put into hutches like this or sent to slaughter within a few days. And they're kept in intensive confinement, the ones who make it to these hutches, for 16 weeks. And then they're sent to slaughter to be sold as veal. The females are also kept in intensive confinement until they're about 6 months old or old enough to be impregnated and reintroduced into the dairy herd. But basically, any childhood that would have been normal to these calves has been taken away from them. And then here are turkeys. If you've ever hung out with turkeys, it took me a long time until I finally started hanging out with turkeys, and I just adore them now. They are funny, darling, affectionate creatures. They're very, very curious, have engaging personalities. Some like to show their plumage off and can be very vain. But as you can see, they're treated a lot like the chickens are. They are raised in intensive confinement, crowded into these massive buildings. Wild turkeys, if you've ever seen them, I did because in Northern California, where I lived most of my life, there were a lot of wild turkeys. They tend to be black. They tend to be sleek. They can actually fly a bit. These turkeys have been bred to grow huge breasts, and they grow so fast that they have painful leg problems. And then they get heart disease and they get heart attacks because their hearts can't handle pumping what's needed for those massive breasts. In the wild, turkeys live 3 to 5 years. The deaths are due to predators, to hunters, and to disease. In captivity, a turkey could live to be 10 to 13 years of age. But in this kind of situation, they're sent to slaughter. The females are sent to slaughter the hens in 14 to 16 weeks. The males are sent to slaughter when they are 19 weeks old. Some facilities send them to slaughter as early as 12 weeks old. So that, now that I've dragged you through the muck, that is a thumbnail sketch of their hellish lives. They live in overcrowded sheds, walking, sitting, sleeping in their own waste, breathing toxic, putrid air, nothing like their lives would be like in a natural environment where they can make choices. And making choices is one of the most important things that can be given to an animal, the ability to make choices. Here they have nothing to do and no privacy. So now what I'd like to do is talk to you about the laws that are in place in the US to protect these animals. And the US is a country that follows the rule of law. So you would expect that there would be robust federal and state laws that protect animals raised in the CAFO system. Guess what? There is no federal law that offers any kind of protection to animals while they are in the CAFO for the 99% of their lives that they are alive. Nothing. It doesn't exist. Zero, zilch, nine, kaput, right? How did that happen? How did the industry get that strong and that powerful to control legislators at the federal level so that no law exists? It's the opposite of the European Union, which has very robust laws. There are two federal laws. One is called the 28-hour law. It was passed many, many years ago. It offers minimal protections to farmed animals during the time that they are being transported, which is a tiny percentage of the time. They're either being transported as young animals to a different facility from where they were born, or they're being transported to slaughter. Unfortunately, this law has not been properly enforced since the 1940s. The three federal agencies that are charged with enforcing the 28-hour law claim that it's not their job, it's somebody else's job. Animals are crowded into trucks. They travel for anywhere from a few hours to days without food or water. They're covered in their own waste. The industry assumes that a certain percentage of them will be injured and that some will die. The death rate is just a cost of doing business. The other federal law that does exist is the Humane Methods of Livestock Slaughter Act. It offers very minimal protections to farmed animals during the slaughter process. It excludes poultry, which is 95% of farmed animals. And it also excludes or exempts ritual slaughter, such as kosher and halal slaughter. So that slaughter, the law doesn't apply. Having the word humane in the title of this law is misleading because the way that slaughter is carried out can't possibly be humane. On a daily basis, huge numbers of animals are rushed through the kill line, stunned, hopefully, and bled to death. Once again, I want to press there is no federal law in the US that protects animals for the 99% of their lives while they are in the CAFOs being raised. There are some state laws. Each state in the US has an anti-cruelty law to protect animals. 75% of the state anti-cruelty laws specifically exclude farmed animals from coverage. Farmed animals are excluded, or common practices that are done to these animals, including those I mentioned to you at the beginning, that are all done without anesthesia and painkillers. The castration, the debeaking, dehorning, all of those are excluded and exempted from the anti-cruelty laws. And since 2002, a few American states have outlawed certain cruel practices, and you can see them on this slide, mostly through the use of what's called the voter initiative process, or the threat of that. Florida has banned gestation crates for pigs. That was the first such ballot initiative law. California has banned gestation crates, veal crates, battery cages, tail docking of cattle, as well as the sale and production of foie gras. In 2018, California voters passed Prop 12, a follow-up law to Prop 2, and it mandates more space for calves and pigs, prohibits the sale of shelled eggs that don't come from cage-free hens. This law is now being, the oral argument for it was heard back in November, and we expect a decision to come from the Supreme Court sometime this spring as to whether Prop 12 will be upheld, because it mandates that anyone who is selling pork and these other products in the state of California has to abide by California law. And the overwhelming plurality of pork producers in the United States, they do want to sell to California. It's a big market, but they don't want to have to change and get the animals out of intensive confinement. So you can read the rest of these for yourself: Arizona, Oregon, Colorado, Michigan, Ohio, the Farm Bureau, and Rhode Island outlawed gestation crates. Voter initiatives, which bypass the legislature and bring the issue directly to the voter, they've been a game changer. They showed consumers for the first time the reality of how farmed animals are raised and how they're treated. And by winning, they showed the meat industry that consumers and voters want them to change how they treat these animals. Unfortunately, only 24 states have voter initiative laws, which leaves billions of farmed animals untouched by the improvements that you see on these slides. So, how can we protect farmed animals who are in these CAFOs? I want to remind you that animals are property, and therefore they are regarded as things within the legal system. With farmed animals, we're trying to protect animals who are owned by the very people who are causing them the harm. And this leaves us in a very precarious position as animal lawyers. We can't bring civil lawsuits in the name of or on behalf of the animals because they're property, they are things. And we can't sue the very individuals who are causing the harm because they own the animals. We don't have enough of an interest that a court would recognize for us to sue them. So we're forced to come up with legal theories that allow us to get into court in ways that may seem somewhat roundabout to you. But that's the state of the law today, and that's all we have to work with. So I'm going to describe to you some of the lawsuits that involve efforts to challenge the CAFO system and have tried to make life better for farmed animals. Now, when I read a case involving farmed animals, I try to see it on more than one level, and I teach this to my students. One level is judges who are grappling with the facts and the law. Another level is to see the decision as an indication of how our society views and treats farmed animals. Every case that we read about the interests of humans versus the interests of animals, I have to tell you, the humans almost always win that battle. Well, the first case I want to talk to you about is a PETA case from some years ago. PETA sued the California Milk Producers Advisory Board. The advisory board put out these very slick commercials, these advertisements that were on TV, they were also in writing. And they said, good cheese comes from California cows, and that California cows are happy. Okay. And they showed pictures like the one you see, where the cow is out in the field by herself. It's a beautiful day out there. When in fact, the reality looks a lot more like what you see in the other picture. She's standing on concrete. Sometimes she's up to her elbows or ankles or whatever in muck. You can see that her hooves have not been cut off. So that's not good. That's not healthy. You can see her ribs. She looks kind of skinny except for her udder. PETA relied on three California laws: California Business and Protection Code 17200, which prohibits unfair competition; California B&P 17500, which prohibits false and deceptive advertising; and then 17580, which prohibits environmental misrepresentation. And what PETA claimed was that these commercials were misleading the public. Conditions in CAFOs are really horrible. These cows are not happy. The calves are taken away from them soon after birth, which is horrible. Downed cows are animals whose bodies have been so overworked that they break down. The result here was a dismissal because the court found that the California Milk Producers Advisory Board is a public entity and it's not a person who could be sued under the statutes, under these California laws. But in bringing the case, PETA was alerting to the public to the conditions that these animals are really raised in and that the commercials were misleading them. Here's another case that was recently brought. A California egg producer, Judy's Family Farm, was putting these pictures and the picture of the chicken. And as you can see, there are the children. They look like little Amish children. That's how we dress children in California, as everyone knows. And the chicken is with her little chicks on the grass. Oh, it's quite lovely. And the butterflies are flying by. So that's what they were telling people was the way that they were raising their chickens. And you can see that they say, these hens are raised in wide open spaces in Sonoma County. That's in Sonoma Valley. That's Northern California, where they are free to roam, scratch, and play. That's reality. That anybody see a chicken out there anyway? Are they roaming? Are they scratching? No, they're not out there. They're stuck in those buildings. They're in those massive buildings throughout their short lives, no access to the out of doors, no fresh air, no sunlight, no grass, no bugs to chase, no little kids in Amish clothing. This deceptive packaging allows that company to profit by misleading well-intentioned consumers, consumers who are willing to spend more money to assure that the chickens receive higher levels of animal welfare, when in fact they don't. So the Animal Legal Defense Fund filed a case as a class action lawsuit on behalf of all consumers who bought and paid a higher price for Judy's eggs under the mistaken belief that the hens were allowed to roam outdoors and have a more natural and really more pleasant lifestyle. ALDF alleged that what Judy's was saying was unfair, deceptive advertising and marketing in violation of those California laws that I went over with the PETA case, the California Unfair Competition Law, False Advertising Law, and Consumer Legal Remedies Act. The class action approach would allow all consumers to recoup monetary damages that they spent on paying more for those eggs. And that could total millions of dollars and send a strong message to that producer and to the industry, hopefully, that misrepresentations about animal welfare will not be tolerated. The status of this case is that it's settled. Judy stopped using that advertising that I showed you, took out the language, took out the chicken graphic. Judy's agreed to pay settlement amounts of $200,000, which included a donation to the local Humane Society, Sonoma County, to build some chicken coops for rescued chickens. The attorneys got attorney's fees, and Judy's agreed to make structural changes to its barns so that the hens would be given more room. Here's another case. This one's out of Illinois rather than California. Another legal theory is that CAFOs create public and private nuisance. Now, the goal of such a case is to force the meat industry to take responsibility for the harm that the CAFO system does to people who live nearby, and to challenge the construction or expansion of CAFOs. If a court determines that the activities of the CAFO constitute a nuisance, relief may include enjoining the CAFO from continuing the nuisance, requiring the CAFO to lessen the nuisance, such as restrictions on what time of day or year the CAFO can release manure, awards of monetary damages to the plaintiff. In this case, Nichols versus Burnett, a case was brought in which the defendants wanted to construct a CAFO that would house 8,000 pigs, and they'd be using those pigs for food. The Illinois Department of Agriculture had authorized the construction of this facility. They're generally referred to as hog facilities. Close to 50 local landowners in a rural community sought an injunction to stop the construction of the facility based on common law public and private nuisance. They presented extensive evidence of the potential harms they would suffer, including a reduction in the value of their land and negative impacts on their health. The plaintiffs put into evidence reports and studies which show that CAFOs cause a variety of problems to the people who live nearby. They produce significant amounts of toxic animal waste and pollute the air, water, and soil. People who live near them suffer from more respiratory illnesses, confusion, tension, depression, and fatigue than people who do not live near CAFOs. It also decreases the value of their homes, sometimes by 50%, because who wants to live near one of these facilities? And I should back up a moment and explain the CAFOs moved in later. Most of these people have lived there, some for generations. And when the CAFOs move in, some of them move in as close as literally across the street from people who have been there for generations. Sometimes it's small scale farmers, and they are pushed out of business. The local economy suffers because the CAFOs take over. In this case, the trial court granted a preliminary injunction to halt the building of the CAFOs, and the Illinois Court of Appeals confirmed. In North Carolina, neighbors of CAFOs have filed 26 separate lawsuits. Now, these neighbors of these CAFOs, in North Carolina, the CAFOs have been built in the eastern part of the state by Smithfield and its subsidiary Murphy Brown. The eastern part of the state is where a lot of Black people, African Americans of lower income live. Some of those people their families have lived there since the end of the Civil War. They purchased property, were able to purchase property, and have stayed there ever since. And then all of a sudden, the CAFO system came in, literally across the street from many of these people, driving their home prices down by 50%, causing them to experience headaches, nausea, sore throats, burning eyes, other negative health effects, polluting their water, polluting the soil. The fecal matter was actually being sprayed into fields and coming over to their houses. It's disgusting, okay? So when I say it stinks, it really stinks. So they were able to get together 500 of these neighbors in 26 separate lawsuits and sue Murphy Brown. And they won each case, and they won large amounts of damages and punitives. And then what happened? Well, the North Carolina legislature, at the demand of the CAFO industry, amended the right to farm law in North Carolina, making it almost impossible to bring a nuisance lawsuit against the CAFOs. Sad. In addition to harming the animals who are forced to live in them, the people who live near, CAFOs also provide little pay and substandard working conditions to the people who work in them. And because of those horrible conditions, diseases such as E. coli and salmonella are on the rise, sickening people who eat these animal products that come from the CAFOs. And during COVID, as you might have noticed, the workers in slaughterhouses who are working shoulder to shoulder with no protection came down with COVID at especially high rates. Let's talk about the environment for a moment. CAFOs produce 2.7 trillion pounds of animal waste, urine, and manure each year. This pollution comes from the buildings you're looking at, where the animals are housed. Those round circles, those are the fans that are sending out the air pollution. The manure, the urine, other chemicals such as antibiotics fed to the animals are coming out, and they're going into this ditch. CAFOs are a hazard to air quality. There are over 168 gases emitted from CAFO waste, including ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and methane. If this is what's natural, no, this is not natural. Traditionally, small farms took the manure and recycled it by spreading it onto their crops for fertilizer. And that was great from the perspective of the environment. It fertilized the plants, okay. But the CAFO system, first of all, there are no crops out here. This is so massive and on such a small area of land that the manure that comes out completely overloads the system. The manure in the urine is collected in these pits that are called lagoons, euphemistically. The runoff from this goes into streams and rivers and lakes. It kills fish. It can contaminate human drinking supplies. It is usually, almost always, not treated to reduce disease-causing pathogens, nor to remove the chemicals, the pharmaceuticals, the heavy metals, or the other pollutants. Human waste is always treated. CAFO waste is not. More than 34,000 miles of rivers and 216,000 acres of lakes and reservoirs in the US have been degraded by the CAFO waste. And they are a major contributor to greenhouse gases and climate change. Using environmental laws such as the Federal Clean Water Act is part of the battle against the CAFO system. In HSUS versus Hudson Valley Foie Gras, Hudson Valley Foie Gras is a CAFO that force feeds ducks to produce foie gras. It's the only remaining foie gras producer in the US. Like all CAFOs, it produces large amounts of manure, some of which was being discharged into a local river. By using the Clean Water Act, the HSUS was able to gain injunctive relief against what they were doing and to stop them from violating the Clean Water Act. They had to pay $50,000 for an environmental project, and the order included a provision that they would be fined $25,000 per day for further violations of the Clean Water Act. Did that help the ducks? No, it didn't help the ducks. They are horribly treated and tortured through the force feeding process. In Community Association for the Restoration of the Environment versus the Cow Palace, that was a case out of Washington State. The Cow Palace, another charming little euphemism, is a dairy production facility. It has a herd of 11,000 cows, including the calves and a few bulls. That's a lot of animals. Annually, this herd produces over 100 million gallons of manure. Some of that manure can be used to fertilize crops, but this massive amount was being overapplied and contributing to high levels of nitrates in the underground drinking water for people in that area. Nitrates can lead to various types of cancer, increase mortality from strokes, lead to death of babies, and lead to heart disease and other things. There's a federal environmental law called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, that governs the treatment, storage, and disposal of solid and hazardous waste in order to minimize the threat to human health and the environment. And those products are regulated under RCRA, but when the law was passed, no one considered the impacts of these CAFOs and of animal waste coming from them. These laws, the environmental laws were all passed in the 1970s, and no one was really thinking about the CAFO system then because it wasn't as big as it is now. So this lawsuit was one of the first to address these impacts. The plaintiffs were an environmental group, and they claimed that RCRA was being violated in two ways. One, the ways in which the Cow Palace handles, stores, and disposes of manure constitutes open dumping of waste, which is banned by RCRA. And two, it caused imminent and substantial endangerment of human health because of the nitrates that were going into the drinking water. The court analyzed how the Cow Palace stored manure in these massive lagoons that are not structurally sound. Basically, the manure and everything else seeps through, it leaks into the groundwater, it accumulates. And the evidence also proved that the practices of applying a lot more manure to the crop areas than could be absorbed for the crops constitutes dumping. So ultimately, after the plaintiffs, the environmental group won at the initial stage, the case then went into negotiation and it's settled. And that was actually a good way to handle the case, because sometimes in reaching a settlement, you can negotiate better terms than you can get in court. So the Cow Palace agreed to a number of improvements to the facility, including the installation of new lining to lagoons that would not allow for seepage. But what about the cows? Because some of these cows were knee-deep in muck. Well, the Cow Palace agreed to install concrete aprons and piping to assure that the wastewater is redirected to the lagoons away from the cows, to install concrete in high traffic areas where the cows are, and to divert wastewater to other places, to regrade some of the wettest spots to avoid water buildup, and to scrape cow manure at least once per week and remove piles of manure at least once per month. Can you imagine what was happening before then? Okay, it's not great, but it's an improvement. At least now they're not standing and lying in their own waste all the time. So environmental laws do address the welfare of the environment. They don't address the welfare of the animals directly, but sometimes in legal efforts, if the environmental attorney is really thinking, they can help not only reduce pollution, but have an impact on the animals as well. Globally, livestock operations are responsible for approximately 18% of greenhouse gas production and over 7% of US greenhouse gas emissions. While the environmental movement has focused on carbon dioxide as the principal contributor to greenhouse gas, manure emits methane and nitrous oxide. Methane is 23 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. Nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So CAFOs are responsible for animal abuse on a massive scale, environmental degradation that taxpayers are footing the bill to clean up, food safety and human health problems, and they provide terrible working conditions for their employees. Vis-a-vis climate change, we're trying to encourage environmentalists to get on the bandwagon and talk about the issue of methane, because methane, if we could get a handle on methane, that would give us more time to get a handle on carbon dioxide. And when we think about climate change and the thin window we have, if everybody would stop eating meat, we would be in much better shape. If even half of the people would stop eating meat, we would be in far better shape, because raising meat is killing us as a planet, as a species. So, what can we do? It's a bad situation. And I have bad news for you. It's not, it's growing, because what started in the US is now being sent out all over the world. The EU, the European Union, there are CAFOs all over. Australia, New Zealand. CAFOs are in China are raising 10 times as many animals as we are in the US, especially pigs. I recently saw a picture of a 26-story building that is completely inhabited by pigs being raised for pork. 26-story building. How are they possibly going to give good treatment to the pigs, not harm the environment? It's absolute craziness. So what can we do? What can we do? We can take a number of positive actions. We can continue to expose the problem. Undercover investigations, such as those done by Animal Outlook, Mercy for Animals, HSUS, PETA, and other groups, give us the evidence that we need. We should spread that around and show people what's happening. We can fight unconstitutional ag-gag laws, which criminalize the use of the taking of photos and videos in and around CAFOs and other animals' facilities. All of the cases that have come to court so far have won. These laws clearly violate the First Amendment of the US Constitution. They're un-American. They are shut 'em up laws, because you see what's happening and now we're going to shut you up. We can educate ourselves about the problem. Those who defend the CAFO system argue that they're the only way to produce cheap, affordable meat for the American people. But in fact, if the CAFO system had to internalize all the costs that we as taxpayers pay, it would be too expensive for them to continue, or the price of meat would go way, way up. Scientists, environmentalists, and public health officials who have studied the CAFO system agree that the negative impacts of the CAFOs are not a sustainable way to produce food, that the negative impacts far outweigh the benefits. And on this slide, you see 3 sources for information about this system just doesn't work. The Union of Concerned Scientists has said the costs we pay too much, too high, undesirable form of animal agriculture. The Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production has said this threatens public health, the environment, animal health and well-being, and rural communities. It's one of the most serious unintended consequences is the growing public health threat. The Foundation for Deep Ecology said Our domesticated livestock have never been as cruelly confined or slaughtered in such massive quantities in all of history. The world's lands and waters are being overwhelmed by animals that consume vast amounts of energy, foul the environment, and when eaten excessively, degrade our health. I encourage you to read each of these reports. If they look a little old, the sad news is they're all quite relevant because the situation has not gotten better, it has gotten worse. So it's something written in 2008, it's relevant. Learn about who farmed animals are, who they are, rather than what they are. When we see them in those massive numbers, it's hard to see them as individuals, but they are individuals. They have personalities, they have needs, they have interests. They're not all the same. Some are shy, some are not so shy, some are quite out there. They have likes and dislikes. Speak out as consumers because industry listens. Smithfield, the nation's largest producer of pork, agreed to phase out gestation crates solely because of consumer pressure. Consumers were told that sows were no longer going to be in gestation crates. Quite recently, HSUS did an undercover investigation and found out that Smithfield is lying. Yes, they're out of gestation crates for about a third of the time, but they're in gestation crates. Then during the pregnancy, they're in group housing, and then they go into farrowing crates. So HSUS is suing Smithfield for misleading the public. We can opt out. Sorry, showing you some nice pictures of chickens and pigs, the way it should be. But we can opt out of supporting this dirty industry with our consumer dollars. We can boycott this industry. We can decide that we will change our diet. There's a new industry, and it is shaking up the meat industry and meat, dairy, and egg industry in a major way. Tofurkey, Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, Miyoko's Cheese, Heidi Ho Cheese, and all of the other fabulous companies that are coming out and producing plant-based milks, yogurts, cheeses, fishless fish, chickenless chicken. It's all happening. And now we've got the cell-cultivated industry, which is so exciting. They are scrambling to minimize the impacts, develop their own plant or cell cultivated products. The world is changing. The meat industry realizes this, and they have to deal with that reality. On a personal level, adopting either a vegan or a vegetarian diet means that you boycott these industries. You don't buy these products. You use your consumer power to support the plant-based and cell-cultivated alternatives to the misery of animals and degradation of our planet caused by the CAFO system. It's healthier for humans, it's better for the cows, the pigs, the chickens, and it's better for the earth. I want to finish by saying that CAFOs constitute one of the major animal rights, animal protection, ethical, public health, and environmental challenges of our generation. Too many people don't even know that these exist. How many people have you met that have no idea that this is the way animals are raised? Or they really don't want to know. Don't tell me, I don't want to hear it. I love my meat, right? Too many people don't know that this system exists. We need to remember that CAFOs are not based on some age-old wisdom. They have existed really for 60, 70 years, and they are a house of cards waiting to topple. If we can make it too expensive for them by attacking what they do to the environment, by attacking what they do to public health and food safety with the overuse of antibiotics and E. coli, salmonella outbreaks, if we can attack it on behalf of the people who have been forced to live next to these places, if we can attack them from the perspective of the workers who work in slaughterhouses or who work in CAFOs, or from the communities that have been disbanded. Remember in the 80s when farmers were being pushed out of business, that wasn't the animal rights activists, it was their own industry that was pushing them out of business. There was a Secretary of Agriculture named Earl Butz. Some of you are old enough to remember that name. He was the Secretary of Agriculture under two presidents. And his motto was get big or get out, get big or get out. And what happened was that it started with the slaughter industry. The slaughter industry merged. And so the small slaughterhouses were sent out of business. And then the big slaughterhouses would only enter into contracts with producers who could give them same size animals and a lot of them. What that meant was if someone had a herd of cattle that were 100 cattle, that wasn't enough anymore. They wanted 1,000 cattle coming in, all of the same weight, or 2,000 pigs coming in per day, okay, or 3,000 or 4,000, and it just kept increasing. So what happened was that the small producers were knocked out of business, and the big producers got contracts with the slaughterhouses. But when the slaughterhouse industry consolidated and the small slaughterhouses went out of business, that also meant that the animals had to be transported longer distances. So it made everything worse. Larger facilities, more animals, way longer transport than they did have. And one of the things that I'd like to see changed, if people are going to eat meat, is that mobile slaughterhouses come into play so that they can go to where the animals are raised and those animals don't have to be transported. Temple Grandin, who designed slaughterhouses, has said, stop transport of animals altogether, kill them where they're raised and just transport the meat. And I know for those of us who are vegan, that's not good enough. But one of the things we've got to recognize is that this system is so bad. We've got to get rid of this system. And people are going to come up with a variety of answers. Some are going to talk veganism, right on. Some are going to talk vegetarianism. Okay. Some are going to say, no, I want to keep eating meat, but I want to go back to regenerative, sustainable agriculture. And what that means is that's the way it used to be. Okay, that's going to happen for some people. What I've offered you in this talk is the tip of the iceberg of what is a very complex, really bad problem. And it's up to you to take action. We need more people to have a clear understanding of what's happening behind closed doors at these CAFO facilities so that we can demand change and develop realistic solutions. I want to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions and to discuss this issue with you anytime. There's my email. I answer all my emails unless I get totally underwater, but then I check back. And if you don't hear back from me, just email me again. So can we take questions now?
Okay, Joyce, wonderful presentation. I have some questions about you and your job. Are
Mhm.
you the only animal rights professor in the law school? And how many students do you have?
Oh, actually, no, I am not the only animal rights professor at Lewis and Clark Law School. We have a program called the Center for Animal Law Studies. And I'd have to count on my fingers how many of us are there.
Oh,
There's several of us. And we
wow.
offer 25 separate courses in
Ah,
animal law. I teach
fantastic.
industrial. Yeah, it's wonderful. We're the only school anywhere in the world that offers all those courses, and students come from all over the world to study with us.
Thank you very much, Joyce Tischler, for your really galvanizing presentation.